Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be removing and installing brake lines on a 2006 Toyota Tacoma using LinesToGo part number BLT-126-SS. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2006 Tacoma, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown on your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made using 304L stainless steel for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Make sure to depressurize the fuel system before starting the installation. Tools required: 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, and 21mm sockets and ratchet. 10mm and 13mm wrenches, pliers and cutting pliers, flat blade screwdriver, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be medium. To depressurize the fuel system, locate the fuel pump fuse using your owner's manual and remove it. Start the vehicle and wait for the engine to stall. Make sure to replace the fuse once completed. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. Next, use a 10mm wrench to remove all 6 threaded fittings from the ABS module. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings from the master cylinder. Use a pair of pliers or a flat blade screwdriver to remove the brake lines from the plastic clips along the firewall. Disconnect the engine wiring harness from the metal support by lifting up on the locking clip. This will allow more room for running the lines in and out of the vehicle. Raise and support the vehicle and use a 21mm socket to remove all 4 wheels from the vehicle. Remove the rubber splash guard from both front inner wheel wells. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings that secure the lower brake line at the right front caliper and remove the line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings from the next section of the right front brake line and remove it from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the top threaded fitting inside of the right front wheel well and remove the first section of the right front brake line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings that secure the lower brake line at the left front caliper and remove the line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings from the next section of the left front brake line and remove the line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the top fitting at the frame-mounted union on the left front of the vehicle. Below the master cylinder, cut the left front brake line using a pair of cutting pliers. Remove the coiled section of the left front brake line from the vehicle. Remove the top section of the left front brake line from the vehicle. Next, using a pair of cutting pliers, cut both rear brake lines in between the engine and the master cylinder. Remove the top section of both rear brake lines from the vehicle. Remove the primary and secondary brake lines from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the two outward-facing threaded fittings from the frame-mounted union underneath the vehicle. Remove the plastic fuel line bracket from the metal tab underneath the master cylinder. Use a flat blade screwdriver to remove the two rear lines from the plastic clips inside of the left front wheel well. Pull the brake lines down, routing them around the fuel lines. Pull down to disconnect the plastic fuel line bracket from the body. This will allow you to pull the fuel lines away from the frame so you can route the brake lines in and out of position. Remove the two remaining front sections of the rear brake lines from the vehicle. Next, we will need to remove the fuel tank. Start by removing the plastic cover from the fuel line connections at the front of the tank. Disconnect the two quick connect fittings by depressing the two tabs to remove them. Have a drain pan ready as some fuel will be left in the lines. Inside of the left rear wheel well, use a 12mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the bracket holding the filler neck lines. This bolt is missing here, but we will replace it during the installation. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the other bolt on the bracket that secures the clamp to the largest tube. Remove the two other lines from the plastic clip and remove the bracket from the vehicle. Loosen the clamp on the large line using a flat blade screwdriver or an 8mm socket. Remove the quick connect fitting from the smallest line by depressing the two tabs to disconnect it. Next, place a support underneath the fuel tank and use a 14mm socket to remove the two bolts that secure the fuel tank straps. Underneath the vehicle, on the other side of the fuel tank, remove the spring clips and pins that secure the two fuel tank straps and remove the straps from the vehicle. Carefully start to lower the fuel tank. There is still a hose connection at the rear of the tank and an electrical connector at the sending unit. You will need to lower the tank a few inches to be able to access them. Once you have enough room to reach on top of the fuel tank, lift up on the plastic cover over the sending unit. The cover just snaps into place. Disconnect the sending unit electrical connector. At the rear of the fuel tank, disconnect the evap tube by depressing the two tabs. Continue to lower the fuel tank and remove it from underneath the vehicle. Remove the two remaining threaded fittings from the frame-mounted union using a 10mm wrench. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the two threaded fittings at the top of the rear flex hoses. If your fittings are overly rusted, you can cut the lines and remove the fittings using locking pliers. Remove the rear brake lines from the plastic clips along the frame. You will also need to remove the fuel vent line from the plastic clips from the fuel tank connections rearward. This will allow you to route the brake lines around the fuel vent line. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the two rear brake lines at the center. Remove the four sections of rear brake lines from the vehicle. At the rear axle, use a 12mm socket to remove the 4 bolts that secure the rear axle lines to the axle and remove the clips from the lines. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 4 threaded fittings from the wheel cylinders and the bottom of the rear flex hoses. Remove both rear axle lines from the vehicle. To begin the installation of your new stainless steel LinesToGo brake lines, start by installing the right rear axle line labeled 06F into position and start the threaded fittings into the right rear wheel cylinder and the bottom of the right rear flex hose. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the left rear axle line labeled 05F into position and start the threaded fittings into the left rear wheel cylinder and the left rear flex hose. Tighten both threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Replace the brackets that secured the original lines and secure them using a 12mm socket. Next, install the left rear brake line labeled 05C into position. Start the front threaded fitting into the bottom rearward facing factory union by hand. Install the next section of the left rear brake line labeled 05D into position, routing the rear of the line over the crossmember. Start the rear threaded fitting into the top of the left rear flex hose by hand. Connect the 2 lines using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the front and rear fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the right rear brake line labeled 06C into position. Start the front threaded fitting into the top rearward facing factory union by hand. Install the next section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06D into position, routing the rear of the line over the crossmember. Start the rear threaded fitting into the top of the right rear flex hose by hand. Connect the 2 lines using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the front and rear fittings using a 10mm wrench. Secure the rear lines into the plastic clips along the frame. Next, install the secondary LinesToGo brake line labeled 02 into position, routing it underneath the hoses and wiring harness. Start the passenger side fitting into the forward horizontal port in the ABS module by hand. Start the other fitting into the forward port in the master cylinder. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the LinesToGo primary brake line labeled 01 into position. Start the passenger side fitting into the rear horizontal port in the ABS module by hand. Start the other fitting into the rear port in the master cylinder. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Secure the lines into the plastic clips. The following few steps are not completely required, however it will give you more room to work when connecting the sectioned lines at the firewall. Place a clean bucket underneath the driver's side of the radiator and open the plastic drain screw to let the coolant drain. Once the flow of coolant slows down, close the drain screw. This will lower the coolant level enough so that you can disconnect the coolant connection at the firewall. Using a pair of pliers, remove the 2 spring clamps that secure the coolant hoses at the heater core connections. Remove the 2 hoses from the heater core. Next, install the first section of the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03A into position. Start the passenger side fitting into the top rearmost port in the ABS module by hand. Next, install the second section of the left front brake line labeled 03B into position. Connect the two sections of line using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Start the bottom fitting into the top port of the factory union inside of the left front wheel well. Tighten the fitting using a 10mm wrench. Tighten the union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Install the next section of the left front brake line, labeled 03C, into position. Start both threaded fittings by hand. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the final section of the left front brake line, labeled 03D, into position and start both fittings by hand. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the first section of the right front LinesToGo brake line, labeled 04A, into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the top rear central port in the ABS module by hand. Start the bottom fitting into the top of the factory union inside of the right front inner fender. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Install the next section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04B into position and start the threaded fittings by hand. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Install the final section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04C into position and start the threaded fittings by hand. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the top section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05A into position. Start one threaded fitting into the top forward central port in the ABS module and tighten it using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the top section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06A into position. Start one threaded fitting into the top forwardmost port in the ABS module and tighten it using a 10mm wrench. Reconnect the wiring harness support at the firewall. Underneath the vehicle, install the final section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05B into position. Start the rear threaded fitting into the bottom inboard facing port in the factory union. Next, install the final section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06B into position. Start the rear threaded fitting into the top inboard facing port in the factory union. Connect the sections of the left and right rear lines at the firewall using the supplied unions, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the two fittings in the factory union using a 10mm wrench. Replace the two coolant hoses at the firewall and secure the spring clamps using a pair of pliers. Top up the coolant level as required. Secure the plastic fuel line clips back into position. Bleed all four wheels using a 10mm wrench at the rear and an 8mm wrench at the front, making sure to keep the master cylinder reservoir topped up with fluid. Once the brakes are bled, hold pressure on the brake pedal for a few seconds to make sure there are no leaks present. Next, we will replace the fuel tank. Raise the fuel tank into place, leaving enough room to connect the wiring harness and the tube at the rear of the tank. Connect the sending unit electrical connector and replace the plastic sending unit cover. Connect the evap tube at the rear of the fuel tank. Continue to raise the tank into position while feeding the filler tube over the frame. Replace the 2 fuel tank straps by replacing the pins and securing them with the spring clips. Secure the 2 fuel tank straps using a 14mm socket and remove the support. Tighten the clamp on the filler tube using an 8mm socket or a flat blade screwdriver. Connect the small line at the quick connect fitting. Next, replace the bracket and secure it into place using a 12mm socket. Install the locking bracket and secure it using a 10mm socket. Connect the 2 fuel line quick connect fittings at the front of the tank and replace the plastic cover. Replace both front splash guards inside of the front wheel wells. Replace all 4 wheels and torque to your manufacturer's recommended specification using a 21mm socket. Replace the negative battery terminal and tighten it using a 10mm wrench. This concludes the installation of stainless steel brake lines on a 2006 Toyota Tacoma using LinesToGo part number BLT-126-SS. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992, email us at info@linestogo.com, or check out our website link below. Don't forget to take advantage of our free next day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you in our next video.